Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Synclavier-V tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at the subject of modulation. This is not to be confused with frequency modulation or FM. That's an entire topic in its own right. What we're talking about here is really basically everything else that modulates. The synthesizer has a very rich modulation matrix, but it also has a couple of pre-configured modulation options, which we're going to have a look at today. Hope you're enjoying the series. If you are, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel. Now, we started off on the envelope and LFO page today because this is where the two basic modulation options are located, vibrato and stereo. Let's deal with vibrato first. Vibrato is simply modulation of pitch over time. Now, the unusual thing about the Synclavier is that we're able to apply vibrato to both the carrier and modulator. By default, they're actually linked together. I'm going to disable this link function just for now so that we can concentrate on the carrier. I'm going to hold a note down. This is the simple sine, so we're just going to get a sine wave. There it is. Make it a bit quieter. And now I'm going to increase the carrier vibrato depth. You can quite clearly hear that vibrato. You can also see it oscillating madly in the oscilloscope. The speed of that vibrato is controlled by the rate knob, so we're currently cycling at 5 Hz, and there's me slowing it down. And round about 3 to 4 Hz with more gentle vibrato than this is where typically, if you want the kind of the classical vibrato sound, that's where you're going to find it. So if I now play, got a very simple kind of crude vibrato there. And one of the features of vibrato that you'll very often find is the concept of attack, because generally speaking, when I play a note, I don't want the vibrato to start instantly. Basically, it's a little bit too much and it kind of gets on your head. So if I play a very simple melody line, okay, it's sounding a little bit sci-fi. If I introduce an attack though of around about half a second, we'll start there. It means now for the first half second of each of those notes, well, we start off at 0 vibrato and then it's gradually introduced. And we get a much more natural sound. And when I play that melody line, there or thereabouts, for the vast majority of the time you couldn't hear any vibrato because the notes were too short. It was just starting to come in and then I'm on to playing the next note and you don't hear it. So this gives you that great ability when you're playing, for instance, a solo, of playing the note statically and then very slowly introducing the vibrato, and it's a lovely effect. The default behavior for the introduction of that vibrato is that it happens exponentially. In other words, it starts off very gently and then the vibrato is basically kind of accelerated. I make the attack a bit longer and a bit deeper so that we can really hear the effect. We start out quite gently and then it gets ever increasingly dramatic. That's accomplished with the S-curve button. If I turn S-curve off, we get a linear slope instead, and now the introduction is absolutely constant from the very beginning. It's quite a subtle effect, but generally speaking, exponential is my preferred option of the two, and happily that's the default. Then we have a bias option. So at the moment, when I press a middle C, I'm going to get 260 Hz, which is the standard note. The vibrato is going to take it above and below. Slow the rate down nice and slowly so that you can see this in the tuner. Going up to 270 odd and down to 250 or 40 odd. If I introduce bias, now the pitch of the note itself, 260, is going to be the low point, and everything, all of the modulation is going to be above. So we're basically going to go twice as high. And there we are up into the 290s. Switch back to standard bias and now engage quantize. You're only going to be able to hear quantize if your carrier amount is more than a semitone, because it's basically going to step up in those semitone increments and you'll hear the discrete values. Kind of a glissando effect. Quantize back off. Don't forget, at the moment, all I'm dealing with is simple pitch variation, but as you'll see in a moment, we can apply vibrato to the modulator and we're going to get different effects over there. Finally, invert simply determines what happens at the beginning. So every time I press a note, it always starts going up. If I engage invert, then we're going to start off by descending. We're going to flip the phase of that wave. There we go, we started off down. Okay, so that's the carrier. Now turn the carrier off. Now I'll introduce frequency modulation to the modulator. In order for us to be able to hear this, we're going to need some FM mod. So let's introduce some. So at the moment we've got no vibrato at all. I haven't introduced it yet. Let's just get ourselves familiar with the sound itself. Now over to vibrato, and we're going to introduce the FM modulator. Very unusual effect. What's actually happening there is that the frequency modulation ratio, in other words, the speed of modulation, is being varied. If you imagine vibrato as something that speeds up and slows down a thing over time, ordinarily we're speeding up and slowing down the pitch or frequency of the sound, of the tone. What we're modulating when we increase the modulator knob is we're increasing or decreasing periodically the rate of modulation, in other words, the FM ratio. So this sound that you're hearing here can be accomplished by increasing and decreasing the FM ratio. Now it's a very subtle effect, so I'll use the fine knob. That's basically what I'm doing, because I am going up and down. So I need to oscillate around the 0 point, not just go positive. But that's basically giving you exactly the same effect. Now let's link those two vibrato options together. So now we're going to vary the pitch at the same time as varying the frequency modulation. Just made the FM mod a little bit deeper there so you can hear the effect nice and clearly. But it is possible to get some absolutely crazy effects using the modulator at faster rates. Think about it, we're applying rapid frequency modulation to the frequency modulation. You can wrap your head around that if you like. Okay, that's the vibrato section done. I'm going to throw all those changes away, get myself back to the simple side. Now let's have a look at the stereo module. It's a weird beast, this one. It's basically two functions in one. It comprises effectively both tremolo and pan, and we mix those two options together using the phase knob. Now by default, the stereo module is in pan mode. In fact, this is actually, if you browse around the presets, you'll find it in pan mode far more often than tremolo mode. And basically we determine that by the phase at 180 degrees. We're going to pan between the left and right stereo fields. The best way, in addition to just listening to it, the nice way to look at this is to watch the stereo output in Cubase behind the scenes. Here we go. So as I increase the depth, this panning between left and right is going to get more and more intense. And obviously the rate is controlling the speed. There we go. So there's the deepest amount of pan, where I'm basically going fully left, fully right. If I switch the phase to 0 or 380 degrees, however, we're going to switch into tremolo mode instead. So I'll do it dramatically. I'll turn the phase all the way down to 0, and now you'll see the stereo outputs are locked, but they get louder and quieter. And you can see that in the oscilloscope as well. But then you can mix those two effects together, so you get a tremolo and a pan simultaneously, where the phase is anything other than 0 or 180. You can see the volume going up and down in the oscilloscope, but you can also see it panning left and right. The attack and S-curve for the stereo are the same as the vibrato, so I'm not going to cover those specifically. Alternate, and it's alternate rather than alternate, because we're talking about alternating between key presses here. Every time I press a key, we're going to switch that effect from one side of the stereo field to the other. Well, we are if we're in pure pan mode, so I'll put us in pure pan mode. It was a nice big depth. Now, every time I press a key, we start off on the right-hand side. If I switch to alternate, however, right, left, left. A preset that uses this to very nice effect, just to demonstrate it a little bit more pleasantly than a sine wave, is in the keys folder, and I'm going to load Mysterious Light. Now, every key that I press, you can hear it panning across the stereo field. It's a really nice effect. And there you can see alternate is engaged. Back on the simple sine preset, to the right of alternate we have invert. Invert in the stereo concept has a very similar kind of effect to what it did with vibrato. In other words, it flips the logic. But bear in mind that if you turn alternate and invert on simultaneously, then you're going to get kind of some interaction between those two. Let's just start off with invert on its own. Every time I press a key, we start off on the right hand side. If I invert it, we're going to start off on the left hand side. That behavior is consistent. You can then overlay alternate on top so that we go left, right, as opposed to right, left, left. The reason why we have these two options and the interaction between these options is really interesting is because if you have multiple partials, let's say you've duplicated the partial and you want to spread that out across the stereo field, a really nice way to accomplish that is with the use of these stereo controls. So if you invert one of those stereo controls, then you're basically going to make those two sounds travel in opposite directions. Beware that there are phase issues when you do this kind of thing. Let's dial up a preset to hear some of this stuff. In the sequence folder, I'm going to load Hold the Notes. And I'm going to turn the delay off because the delay is kind of clouding the issue. I don't want to hear that. I'm just going to hold a note down. So now you can hear that kind of spreading around in the stereo field. But if I play multiple notes, you'll hear all of those notes interacting from different directions. And if we have a look at how many partials are in action here, 3 partials. So partial 1, both options are off. Partial 2, both options are on. Partial 3, just alternates on. When I'm looking at these two options to see whether or not they're having an effect on the preset, just bear in mind that they're not doing anything if the depth isn't turned up. That's the primary control for the master feature itself. So those are the two baked in options. Every partial has access to both of those all the time. Then we have a set of dynamically controllable modulation. I'm going to head over to the Mods tab. This is the Modulation Matrix. It looks very confusing, but it actually isn't. It's relatively straightforward. The first thing you have to bear in mind is that there are 12 partials, so each row is just dealing with one partial. Very commonly, when you look at modulation matrices in plugins, you have an XY effect. Source is usually across the top, destination is down the left-hand side. That's not the case here. Got partials down the left-hand side, so we're talking about rows. And the way the modulation is separated is that we have source at the top and destination at the bottom. I'm going to show you the modulation matrix from the perspective of a preset. I'm going to load up the lead Bratar preset. Here it is. This is what it sounds like. Down the left hand side we've got pitch bend assigned to every partial, and this is very common. This is actually how pitch bend works. I'm just going to solo partial 1, play a note and increase the pitch bend. It went up. If I double click on pitch bend, do exactly the same thing. There's the note, there's me turning up the pitch bend, and even though you can't see it on the interface, I am, and I'm not having any effect anymore. So this is actually how you connect pitch bend to the synthesizer. It's not done by default. Similar kind of thing, I don't currently have a sustain pedal attached to this keyboard, but it's pretty obvious what that does. Next along, we start to see our first kind of genuinely interesting option. We have key dynamics mapped to FM amount. First of all, what's key dynamics? Well, this is a separate tab, the only tab we haven't looked at so far, whereby we determine how much of an effect is applied to the synthesizer generally. This is kind of an overall modulation amount, depending on the specific key that we press. So if I play a very low note, this little vertical line appears to tell me where on the graph I am. So at the moment, there's a small amount of modulation. This is, at the moment, a completely generic and pointless modulation amount. It has to be mapped somewhere. So this lowest note is applying this much modulation to something somewhere else, and we don't care what. If I play a high note, then we're applying more modulation. So as I span up the keyboard, I now have the option to do something in increasingly dramatic manner to a destination somewhere in the system. Now we jump back over to the modulation matrix and we find out what that key dynamics is mapped to. It's mapped to the frequency modulation amount. And we have an extra wrinkle here. It's actually mapped backwards. So I'm getting to show you two things for the price of one here. First thing that I'm going to do is turn key dynamics off completely. We'll just remember that it's -161. This is the native raw sound without any key dynamics being applied. I'll play a middle C. There's the sound. We have a look over in the mixer. This is our FM mod, our FM amount, and it sounds like that. As I turn FM mod up, you can hear that effect being more dramatic. It was about 0.12, that's close enough. Now what I'm going to do is play that note and increase the key dynamics amount, and you'll hear the frequency modulation increase in exactly the same way. Okay, double click it to set back to 0. So this is basically like a layer, a masked layer that we can apply to frequency modulation to say, depending on the pitch of the key that I press, increase more and more of this thing over the span of the keyboard. But this effect is negative. So flip that logic. The way I like to think about kind of negative modulation is do all of your mental gymnastics in a positive direction, figure out what it's doing, and then right at the end of the story, when you've figured out what this modulation setting is doing, just invert the logic. It's a really simple way to think about it. So now in negative territory, the lowest keys are going to have the most frequency modulation and the highest keys are going to have the least, because previously those two statements were opposite. So let's make key dynamics a bit more dramatic. There's my low keys having frequency modulation applied, and my high keys have less applied. Why would we want to do this? Well, because this is a brass sound, those low sounds have got kind of more growl to them. We're accomplishing that effect via frequency modulation, and we're saying for the low notes, do it a little bit more. Next along, we have the modulation wheel doing something. What's it doing? It's controlling the vibrato depth. I'm going to play a note, turn my modulation wheel up, here it goes. There's the modulation vibrato coming in. Now then, have a listen to this modulation as it comes in, because something else is happening as well. So have a listen to that rate, the vibrato rate. It gets faster as I increase the modulation wheel. The reason for that is 3 columns to the right. We have a second mapping to modulation wheel. So this is a good illustration of mapping the same function, the same modulation source, to multiple different commands. The modulation wheel is mapped to vibrato depth, but it's also mapped to vibrato rate. So in addition to increasing the vibrato, as I turn up the wheel, I'm also making it go faster. Can you also see that the background color of these controls becomes increasingly purple the more they are? So you can kind of very quickly see across the matrix which functions are performing the greatest load, the heaviest lifting. Next along we have velocity. This is another very common thing. Velocity is tied simply to volume. This is what gives us key sensitivity, velocity sensitivity. If I didn't have any of this mapped, then you wouldn't have any. So let's set it to 0. Now, here's my light key. Now I'll hit that key nice and loud. It's exactly the same volume, but it's a different tone. Why? Because velocity is mapped to something else as well. Immediately to the left of it, we can see here's velocity, and it's mapped to frequency modulation amount. But wait a minute, frequency modulation amount is also mapped to key dynamics. So we've got crossovers of sources and destinations doing different jobs. You can configure your modulation matrix to be as complex as you want. Let's have a look at how we perform that configuration. Well, if I click in the velocity button at the top of the matrix, I now have an option to choose all of my sources. So here are all of the various sources that I can pick. And down at the bottom, I can pick my destinations, nice and simple. And as you can see, for something like the harmonic envelope, where you've got multiple different options, you don't click the harmonic thing itself. That's just a label. The functions are off to the right. And there's a bug in this interface as well. You see it says kind of crossfade. I think it says crossfade enabled. If you actually choose that button, then the feature goes away. But if you click any other button, when you go back in again, it appears again. So just ignore that crossfade N or whatever it is on your system. That's just an interface glitch. I'm just going to show you one more example of a modulation matrix option. It's in the preset called Black Tulips. Let's dial up that one. And this is something a little bit more complex, so we'll just stretch our legs a little bit. So we've got amp env partial 1. Have a think about that. The amplitude envelope for partial 1 looks like this. I have to press a key to actually see it. And there it is. That big thing is the amplitude envelope. This triangle is a modulation source. It can be used just like any other modulation source anywhere in the system. So this is partial 1 applying its amplitude envelope to do some work on partial 3. So we have interaction between the partials here. Just as a matter of interest, let's click the button to see how we got there. I clicked on amp envelope, and then I get to choose which envelope I'm talking about. Well, I'm talking about the envelope of partial 1. What's it doing? Well, it's mapped to a harmonic envelope decay. Let's click that button to see a little bit of context. Here's the harmonic envelope. Here are all of the options for that envelope, and we've selected decay. So just have a bit of a think about this. What's actually going on? Partial 1, the triangle, is applying some modulation to partial 3. So let's hear partial 3. What does that sound like? It's quite quiet. I'll just turn it up a bit. There's partial 3. Something is happening to the harmonic envelope decay in that sound. So let's jump over to the envelope. Let's have a look at the harmonic envelope for partial 3. Here it is. It's very big, so I'll double click. There it is. It's 30 seconds long, but you try to spot any motion, any behavior in that envelope. Where's my dot? It's not there because it's been disabled. The envelope's been disabled by setting this modulation amount to -1. Now this is kind of inception level understanding. You need to understand multiple concepts to try to figure out what this value is actually doing. That's why I'm showing you this particular one. Let's turn off the modulation completely. Go back to 0. Just double click on it to set it to 0. Now when we play a note, you see the 30-second journey that this decay is going to take. So now we get to kind of understand what the modulation amount is doing. By default, this behavior wants to have this modulation of the harmonic envelope. The frequency modulation is going to decrease over the course of 30 seconds. And you hear that in the sound. Now let's start reintroducing that modulation. I'm going to introduce a little bit, about 0.2. We've got a triangle in the background that's going to try to modulate our harmonic envelope. Let's see if we can figure out what it's doing by introducing that little bit of negative modulation. Here we go. So over the course of those first few seconds, it was travelling faster. The amplitude envelope from partial 1 is having a modulation effect. You can see it fast speeding up. But eventually that amplitude is done. After about 4 seconds, we saw it had no more work to do. And so it slows down and returns to its native rate. Here we go, look. It's travelling really slowly by the time it gets to the end of its journey. If I carry on going up, you can see that speed get increasingly dramatic. So it's travelling faster at the beginning of its journey and then it slows down. But that's not actually what we had. We had it turned up all the way to -1, which is basically infinite, so we're jumping straight to the sustain point. There's us almost there. One of those things where you kind of observe the birth of the universe by seeing just after the birth of the universe. So there's almost as fast as we can increase the speed. And eventually, there we go, it's more or less instantaneous. and -1 actually is instantaneous. Why would you want to do this? Well, because this envelope might be doing other work elsewhere in the system, but for this particular partial, for this particular effect, we want to disable that functionality and take it away. So partial 3's harmonic decay has been suppressed by partial 1. We are still in full control of that modulation amount. I can do whatever I want with it and kind of tailor that sound to my taste. That's a really interesting way to kind of reverse engineer how a modulation matrix setting works. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into how you can configure these things yourself. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.